in here. Um, I think the biggest issue for people in the 19th is most certainly the economy, but in the world stage that we have right now, I want to ask you about terrorism first.
Sure.
What just happened in Orlando, obviously so horrific. What's your plan? What can you do as a member of Congress, and what should this nation do to fight this scourge of terrorism?
Yeah, I mean, when I look at what the enemies that America faces in the 21st century, I think we are just as likely to fall prey to victim by terrorism by a click of the mouse, or an interruption with our water system, our transmission system, interruption of our financial information or personal information. And I don't see a defense budget that is evolving fast enough to this new threat. I think we've seen since 9/11 that we face threats from diffuse sources across the globe, and we spend more on our military budget than all of the rest of the additional industrialized nations combined. And so the job of a member of Congress is really to make sure that we're keeping Americans safe, but making sure that our military and our intelligence communities have the resources they need to keep ahead of the terrorists and gather the intelligence that we need to prevent the next Orlando and the next domestic attack, as well as a foreign attack on our allies and interests.
So you're saying more money, more resources?
It's more of a case of reallocation of funding. So, the United States has often thought that we need to be able to fight two major theater conflicts at any time. And we do have traditional enemies in the world still that we need to keep safe from. But I think we need to devote more resources and reallocate those resources towards this emerging non-state threat that we're seeing through terrorist cells across the globe.
Do you support a ban on Muslims coming to this country?
Absolutely not. The United States has always been a nation of immigrants. If we ever cease to be the place that attracts hardworking people wherever they come from, whatever they believe in, and reward that work in a constitutional-based economy based on law and fairness, I don't think we'll be a great country anymore. We have many, many Muslims that contribute positively both to our culture and the economy, and I would welcome that and continue that into the 21st century.
And more specifically, Syrian refugees, how would you handle them coming to the country?
I think the United States, with the advice and consent of our defense community and our intelligence community, could absorb those refugees. Again, we have always been a nation that accepts folks. Give us your war-torn or challenged individuals or folks that want to come to this country to create a new life. And I think that the United States could absorb that number of refugees, provided that our defense community screens them properly.
And in the war on terror, are you willing to make compromises, personal freedoms to protect lives?
This has always been a debate here in the United States. This goes back to the 18th century with sedition laws. We've had this conversation for a long time in the United States. Remember, we have a constitution that guarantees the rights to our own freedoms, and we can't sacrifice those freedoms in the effort to keep Americans safe.
So it's a fine line you've got to tread, you're saying?
It is a fine line. It's a case-by-case example. But I believe that we are not a nation anymore in the United States if in order to keep ourselves safe from terrorists, that we are no longer a free people that protects the rule of law and privacy of individuals.
Okay. Let's talk the economy. It's such a sprawling district. You have so many different types of constituents as you crisscross the district, but a lot of them are hurting, obviously. What do you do to make their lives better, to make their pocketbooks stronger?
I think it starts with health care. When you look at a typical family's budget, often what they're spending out of pocket are health care costs. Their deductibles are going up. The Affordable Care Act did a very good job of covering new individuals. We have a lot of work left to do to make sure that we keep the cost of health care low. And there are things that we can do in Congress, like negotiate for bulk pricing options for prescription drugs for Medicare and Medicaid. I think we can work through the Affordable Care Act to reward more value-based care rather than fee-for-service. I think the federal minimum wage, which is at $7.25, could go up. I don't think there is any family in the United States of America that can make a living on that. And it's supporting the local issues that can create an economy here in upstate New York. We have to invest in infrastructure, broadband and high-speed internet, because those are the utility challenges of the 21st century. We invested in canals and railroads in the 19th century here in upstate New York. We invested in the best airports and highway systems in the 20th century. The 21st century has to invest in internet services in order for us to be a part of the 21st century economy here in upstate New York.
Let me ask you specifics on a couple of those points you raised. Affordable health care. You're saying that you support it. Do you want to further it? Are there holes in it now that you see?
The Affordable Care Act is not perfect. I'm particularly concerned by the number of young people that are choosing to pay penalties rather than sign up. There isn't a week that goes by in this congressional race that I don't talk to a family that talks about how their deductible plan has gone up or plan that they favored is no longer available, but we can't scrap it. It eliminates pre-existing conditions as a cause for not being able to receive insurance payments, and that's a good thing. I think that, again, by negotiating for cheaper bulk prices and rewarding doctors that do preventative care and also focused on value-based outcomes rather than fee-for-service will help make the Affordable Care Act control costs in the long term.
And what about small businesses who claim that it's hurting them and forcing them to change their way of business in a negative way?
Yeah, and small businesses are the heart of economic growth here in upstate New York. We need to do all we can to help small businesses, and that includes helping them and their employees afford deductibles and healthcare plans that's within reach.
And the same with the minimum wage you talked about. Obviously, a lot of small businesses have reacted negatively toward that, saying that it's going to force them to cut employees, to automate possibly, to even shut down. How do you mesh the higher minimum wage with the needs of small businesses?
That's absolutely right. Now remember, this would be a federal minimum wage that I would be voting on, which is at 7.25, far less than what New York has had for a very long time. But I think it is important to give people at least a living wage. It is important to consider the concerns of small businesses. Many of those are operating on small margins themselves. And I think the New York approach, understanding that not every region of the country can stomach the same exact wage rate, was the proper course of action to take.
You also mentioned prescription drug prices. Again, that's tough, especially for a lot of seniors. What's your answer there to fight that rising cost of prescription drugs?
Well, I've worked for AARP as a reporter since 2004, and we have seen the steady increase, particularly of prescription drugs as a sector of the healthcare outlay. This has increased in price many times above the rate of inflation. And again, it's madness to me that the United States government would not leverage the full power of our government to negotiate for cheaper bulk prescription prices for our Medicare and Medicaid seniors.
So that's something you do on day one, is try to get that pushed through?
I think that's the number one thing we can do to control healthcare costs for the average people's pocketbooks right here in this congressional district.
Okay. And in the congressional district, we'll segue right into that. A couple of more parochial questions, and again, I think it does impact parts of your district, but fracking. Where do you stand on that?
One of our most precious resources here in upstate New York is water. We don't think of ourselves as living in the Saudi Arabian oil fields of water, but we do. It's important for agriculture. It's important for our rural communities, many of which do not have municipal water systems. And I have been opposed to fracking in the state of New York because it jeopardized those water resources without really creating good, long-lasting paying jobs at a time where I believe we need to be transitioning away from fossil fuels and not towards it.
And what do you say to the people who are in the southern tier and along the Marcellus Shale region who say they're just dying financially and they need that? What's your answer to them?
I'm a farmer. I grew up on a farm in Columbia County. I know the story. I grew up through the 80s to watch lots of mid-scale dairies go out of business and that their kids moved away and weren't interested in farming anymore. And if you're a farmer and the only value you have is the equity in your land and perhaps the mineral rights, I can see why that would be attractive. But when I look at the quality of fracked gas, particularly in the state of New York relative to Pennsylvania, I don't believe that it would create many good paying jobs or many good paying contracts for the landowners, and for those reasons I've opposed it.
Okay, we're talking about the environment there. There's probably no bigger environmental issue in New York State right now than the Hoosick Falls and Petersburg water crises. Do you think, give me your reaction to how the state has handled it in the past and going forward.
The people of Hoosick Falls deserve to know exactly what happened to their community, how long the state knew about this problem, and have a right to make sure that they will not be on the hook to give them the proper water resources they need to continue as a community. If you look at any community on earth, if they run out of water, that community ceases to exist. And it's a few things. It's the fairness of making sure that if a company or a corporation did pollute that water system, that they're held responsible and liable for that cleanup. And it's also an issue that applies for congressmen across this country, which is that we have not done a very good job of maintaining the infrastructure that our parents and grandparents have built. And we have a responsibility to maintain that infrastructure. You cannot have a community with quality water sources, and we owe that community of Hoosick Falls and their neighbors a pathway to addressing those infrastructure issues.
The Democratic administration in the state of New York says it is fully addressing the issue. The acting DEC commissioner said at a hearing last week that they have literally done everything possible to help the people of Hoosick Falls. Do you agree with that, or can more be done?
I think we can do more. I think we should be holding hearings to find out exactly what happened and the fastest course of action to address this wrong for the people of Hoosick Falls.
What do you want to see done, besides hearings, to actually help the people, to make their water safer, to make their lives better? What do you want to do right away?
If the company is liable for that pollution, then that company should be held responsible for rebuilding that infrastructure. And the state needs to facilitate that process in the best way it can.
Okay. Here's a couple of more personal questions. Tell me something about yourself, tell the viewers something about yourself that might surprise them.
Well, I grew up on a fourth-generation farm in Livingston, Columbia County. I'm the product of the public high school system there. The public high school teachers took me under their wing, and I was lucky enough to get scholarships to good schools like Princeton and Brown, and that's usually where the story ends for people like me. We raise great families here in upstate New York, and we often don't provide the job opportunities for them to stay here. And what makes my story different is that I have come back to this area because, like so many people here, I see the challenges that we face here, but I love it, and now I want to fight for it as the next member of Congress.
But just tell me something personal about yourself. So, you know, some hobby, some interests, some love.
Yeah, sure. I have a brand new son. I'm a brand new dad. My son, John Abraham, is 2 months old. Folks said that running for Congress would be tough and I wouldn't be getting a lot of sleep, and now with a newborn in the house, that's definitely true.
Okay. Outside of your town in the district, give me your favorite place in the district.
The entire Catskill Region Park is in this district, and I can think of no better place to spend on a summer afternoon than to sit on one of the peaks of the Catskills, Hunter Mountain, Black Dome Mountain in Greene County, and survey what a beautiful part of the world that we live in that we take for granted every time we drive around.
And how daunting is the size of the district?
This is the second largest congressional district in New York State. It takes 3 hours to get from one end to the other. We spend an awful lot of time in the car burning the treads off of our tires and getting from one end of the district to the other.
But it can be done.
It can be done and has to be done.
Tell me, you talked about your farming background, but specifically tell me what separates you from your opponent in the primary.
You know, I think folks that compare a lot of our policies between Zephyr Teachout and myself might not see a lot of difference in our interest in addressing income inequality and a living wage, protecting the environment, standing up for women's rights. But the difference is that I have been able to hold elective office in a district that's been tough for Democrats. And all of the local wins that I've had in that office, such as banning fracking locally and supporting clean energy technologies and standing up to corporate utilities on behalf of the ratepayers, have happened because I have been able to bring along Republicans. And that's the job. That is the job. It's one thing to talk to the Democrats about fracking and rally them up. It's quite another thing to do to get other folks that don't necessarily believe in every issue that you support to come along with you. I've stood fast on my democratic ideals as a Democrat, but I've worked well with Republicans to get results in this district, and I think I can hang my hat on that.
The latest Siena Research poll has you fairly far behind. Can you overcome that?
We can, and our own internal polling shows that this is a much closer race. It's a June 28th primary. That's for those folks that are following politics know that when you have an electorate that small in an off-election season, it's very hard to predict who will turn out. We've got a lot of enthusiasm for us in the Hudson Valley. We've been working very hard to introduce ourselves to folks in the rest of the part of the district, and we feel good that we have a great shot at this race in June.
Okay. I want to go back to one issue that I skipped over when we talked about terror, because it's brought up the whole idea of gun control. You know, you see Newtown, you see West Virginia, now we see Orlando, and that's just, you know, mentioning a few of them. Is gun control the answer to stop these type of attacks?
You know, I come from a farm. I am a gun owner. I grew up on a farm where guns were a very unemotional item. My grandfather was the president of my local gun club. But I do think we have a gun violence problem in this country. And I do think there are simple things that we can do at the federal level that do not seriously infringe on Second Amendment rights that could keep us safer. Background checks are something lots of politicians talk about, but we have to make sure that it's not just an unfunded mandate, that we provide the resources for state and local agencies to put data into those background systems so that we can prevent the next Orlando. I think any responsible gun owner could submit to the waiting period for closing the gun show loophole, or allowing those that are on the no-fly list to not have access to those firearms. I think those are common sense steps that we can do to keep Americans safer that might prevent the next Orlando.
Do you support the SAFE Act here in New York State?
You know, I think aspects of the SAFE Act were problematic to me as a local council member, the way that it was passed as an object of necessity without enough stakeholders around the table. I think it's moving in the right direction. I think the fact that the state moved away from the 7 magazine clip limit, revised that, has excellent provisions in it for doctors to report suspicious mental health activities to the officials. I think that we could make that into a good law, but we have more work to do on it.
Where do you stand on the NRA and its stance? I mean, the NRA is pretty darn vehement about no touching of the Second Amendment. Obviously, you're saying, there can be some restrictions. How do you feel about the NRA?
Absolutely. If I make it into this seat and I'm sworn in at the U.S. Capitol, I'll raise my right hand and swear to uphold the Constitution, and that includes the Second Amendment. But the NRA needs to understand that it is not a serious infringement on Second Amendment rights to provide background checks and screenings for those individuals that might willfully do harm to Americans. This is not an issue of taking guns away from people. This is about making sure that law enforcement officials have the tools that they need to prevent individuals that we know have an intended harm to not have access to high-capacity weapons.
All right. One chance for you to look into the camera and say what you want, almost like a closing statement, if you will. But look into the camera and tell the voters on the 19th why they should elect you.
Sure. I'm running for this district to represent the community that I grew up in, to do all I can to return power back into the hands of ordinary citizens, and to make upstate New York a place where our kids and grandkids can raise families and make a living again.